The galaxy knows the Sith as villains, as dark lords who wielded red lightsabers and commanded vast armies in their quest for domination. History records their defeats: Darth Bane's rule of two, the fall of Exar Kun, the destruction of Emperor Palpatine. But these are merely chapters in a saga that spans 25,000 years, a story of empires that rose from the ashes of defeat, only to burn brighter and more terrifying than before. This is not the story of individual Sith lords, though we will meet many. This is the story of the Sith Empire itself, a civilization that challenged the Republic for galactic supremacy across millennia, that survived extinction events that would have ended any other culture, that transformed from a primitive theocracy into the most technologically advanced military power the galaxy has ever known. The Sith Empire fell and rose 7 times across history, 7 distinct incarnations, each more dangerous than the last, each learning from the failures of its predecessors, from the original Sith species on Korriban to the hidden empire that returned after 1,000 years of exile, from the ancient Sith civilization conquered by dark Jedi exiles to the final Sith eternal that nearly destroyed the New Republic. To understand the Sith, one must understand that they were not simply evil for evil's sake. They represented a philosophy, a way of viewing the Force and existence itself that was fundamentally different from the Jedi. Where the Jedi saw the Force as something to serve, the Sith saw it as something to dominate. Where the Jedi sought peace through harmony, the Sith sought power through conflict. Where the Jedi believed in selfless devotion to the greater good, the Sith celebrated individual ambition and strength. This philosophical difference made the conflict between Jedi and Sith inevitable. It wasn't merely a political rivalry or a dispute over territory. It was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of existence, about what sentient beings should strive for, about whether compassion or power should guide civilization. This made every Sith-Jedi war not just a military conflict, but an ideological battle for the soul of the galaxy itself. The story of the Sith Empire is therefore the story of an idea that refused to die. No matter how many times the Sith were defeated, no matter how thoroughly their civilizations were destroyed, the core philosophy survived. It survived in hidden holocrons, in the memories of survivors, in the dark side nexus points scattered across the galaxy, and most dangerously, in the hearts of those who believed the Jedi way was wrong. This is their complete story: every empire, every rise and fall, every transformation that made them the greatest threat the galaxy has ever faced, every lesson learned through millennia of conflict, every innovation in dark side philosophy and Sith sorcery, every military campaign that shook the foundations of the Republic, every individual Sith Lord whose actions shaped the course of galactic history. We will trace the Sith from their origins as a primitive species on a forgotten desert world to their final defeat at the hands of the last Jedi. We will see how they evolved from tribal priest kings to galactic emperors. We will understand why they kept rising even after extinction-level defeats, and we will discover why, despite all their power and all their victories, they were ultimately doomed to fail. This is not a simple tale of good versus evil. The Sith Empire's story is more complex, more tragic, and more enlightening than that. It is a story about the seductive nature of power, about how the pursuit of strength can corrupt even noble intentions, about how fear and anger can be harnessed into terrible purpose, and about how an entire civilization can dedicate itself to a philosophy that guarantees its own destruction. The complete timeline of the Sith Empire begins 28,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, in an age when the galaxy was young and the Force was still poorly understood. It ends 35 years after the Battle of Yavin, when the last heir of Palpatine's vision was finally extinguished. Between these points lies a history of empires, wars, betrayals, and transformations that shaped the galaxy more profoundly than any other force in history. This is their story. Act 1. The Ancient Scythe, the Birth of an Empire. Chapter 1. The Red Sith of Korriban, the Species Before the Empire. 28,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, long before the Galactic Republic united the core worlds, long before the Jedi Order established its temple on Coruscant, the Sith were not an empire. They were not even conquerors. They were simply a species, one of countless, force-sensitive races scattered across the galaxy, living in isolation on a harsh desert world called Korriban. The Sith species had evolved in one of the most inhospitable environments in the known galaxy. Korriban was a world of red sands and black stone, of burning days and freezing nights, of sandstorms that could strip flesh from bone and underground water sources that were often poisoned. Survival on this world required strength, cunning, and an intimate connection to the force that permeated the planet's very stones. The original Sith were red-skinned humanoids with distinctive bone spurs protruding from their faces and tentacle-like protrusions hanging from their chins. Their physiology was adapted perfectly to Korriban's harsh environment. Their red skin protected them from the intense solar radiation. Their facial structures helped filter sand from the air they breathed. And most significantly, every member of their species was born with some degree of force sensitivity, making them unique among galactic civilizations. The Sith civilization developed slowly over millennia. They built their first permanent settlements in the canyons and caves that offered protection from Korriban's brutal surface conditions. They domesticated the local fauna, including the massive Tukata hounds that would later become symbols of Sith power. They developed a written language based on angular characters that could be easily carved into stone, and gradually they began to organize themselves into a hierarchical society based on force ability and blood descent. The Sith's social structure was rigid and unforgiving. At the top were the Sith Lords, individuals of exceptional force power, who ruled as priest-kings over their respective domains. These lords were believed to be closer to the dark side of the Force, which the Sith viewed not as evil, but simply as the natural expression of power and passion. Beneath the lords were the warriors, individuals with moderate force ability who served as military commanders and enforcers. Below them were the priests, who maintained the temples and performed the rituals that the Sith believed were necessary to maintain their connection to the Force. And at the bottom were the slaves, captured from rival clans or born into servitude, who performed all menial labor. The Sith did not have a unified government for most of their early history. Instead, their species was divided into dozens of competing kingdoms, each ruled by a Sith Lord who claimed descent from one of the ancient bloodlines. These kingdoms fought constant wars among themselves, with territory and resources changing hands through both military conquest and force-powered duels between rival lords. It was a brutal society, but it was also meritocratic in its own way. Any Sith who could demonstrate superior force ability could challenge their superiors and claim their position if victorious. The most important cultural institution of the ancient Sith was the concept of the Sithari, a prophesied perfect being who would lead the Sith to dominance over all other species and then destroy them to make them stronger. This prophecy was ancient even by Sith standards, dating back to the earliest oral traditions. It spoke of a leader who would unite the fractured Sith kingdoms, who would unlock the deepest secrets of the Force, and who would be willing to sacrifice everything, even the Sith themselves, in pursuit of ultimate power. The Sithari prophecy would shape Sith philosophy for millennia to come. It established the idea that destruction and rebirth were necessary for evolution, that sacrifice of the weak made the strong stronger, and that the ultimate goal was not preservation but transformation. Even after the original Sith species was nearly extinct, their dark Jedi conquerors would adopt this prophecy and interpret it through their own philosophical lens. The ancient Sith's understanding of the Force was intuitive rather than trained. They had no formal education system, no academy where young Force users learned standardized techniques. Instead, knowledge was passed down through oral tradition, through rituals performed in the temples, and through direct master-apprentice relationships between powerful Sith lords and their chosen successors. This meant that Sith Force techniques varied greatly depending on bloodline and region, with some clans specializing in physical augmentation, others in mental manipulation, and still others in what later generations would call Sith sorcery. The Sith built their most impressive monuments in the Valley of the Dark Lords, a vast canyon on Korriban that served as the species' primary burial ground for their greatest rulers. Here, massive tombs were carved into the canyon walls, each designed to house not just the physical remains of a dead Sith Lord, but also, according to their beliefs, the Lord's spirit and power. These tombs were engineering marvels with elaborate trap systems, hidden chambers, and force-reactive crystals that preserved the dark side energy of their occupants for millennia. The construction of these tombs reveals something crucial about Sith philosophy, even in its earliest form. They believed that power could transcend death. A truly powerful Sith Lord could anchor their consciousness to their tomb, continuing to influence the world even after physical death. This belief would later be refined and expanded by the dark Jedi exiles who conquered the Sith, eventually leading to techniques like essence transfer and Force ghost manifestation. The Sith species also developed early forms of alchemy, the art of using the Force to alter living tissue and create new organisms. The Tukata warhounds were likely an early product of this practice, originally created by manipulating the genetics of native Korriban predators. The Sith believed that life itself was just another form of matter to be shaped by will and power, a philosophy that would horrify the Jedi when they eventually encountered it, but which the dark Jedi exiles would embrace and expand upon. For approximately 23,000 years, the Sith species developed in complete isolation. They had no contact with other civilizations because they had not developed spaceflight technology. Their entire existence was confined to Korriban, and later, a handful of barely habitable moons in their home system. They were powerful in the Force, but technologically primitive, building monuments that would last millennia, but unable to leave their homeworld. This isolation ended approximately 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, when the first Dark Jedi exiles discovered Korriban. What happened next would transform a primitive Force-sensitive species into the foundation of the greatest dark side empire the galaxy would ever know. But before we can understand that transformation, we must first understand who these Dark Jedi were, where they came from, and why they sought refuge on a remote desert world at the edge of known space. Chapter 2. The Dark Jedi Exiles. The 100-Year Darkness, 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Galactic Republic, was young but already spanning thousands of systems across the core worlds and Inner Rim. The Republic was not yet the massive bureaucratic entity it would become. It was a more loosely organized confederation of worlds, united by common interest and protected by the Jedi Order, an ancient organization of Force users dedicated to peace and justice. The Jedi Order itself was already thousands of years old at this point, tracing its origins back to the Jedi Order on Tython and the even more ancient Force traditions that predated galactic civilization. The Jedi had established their philosophy firmly. They were servants of the light side of the Force, guardians who used their powers to protect life and maintain peace. They believed in self-sacrifice, in denying personal ambition for the greater good, in seeking harmony with the Force rather than dominance over it. But not all Force sensitives agreed with this philosophy. Within the Jedi Order, a faction began to emerge that questioned the fundamental assumptions of Jedi teaching. They asked, why should the Force be served rather than commanded? Why should personal ambition be suppressed rather than celebrated? Why should passion and emotion be denied when they clearly strengthened one's connection to the Force? And most controversially, why should the dark side of the Force be feared and avoided rather than studied and mastered? These questions were not new. They had been asked periodically throughout the Jedi Order's history, usually by individual Jedi who eventually left the Order peacefully to pursue their own paths. But around 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, these questions coalesced into an organized movement within the Order itself. A faction of Jedi Masters and their students began openly advocating for a more balanced approach to the Force, one that incorporated study of the dark side alongside the light. The traditionalist Jedi leadership, led by the Council, rejected this proposal. Absolutely. Their position was based on millennia of observation. The dark side was not simply another aspect of the Force to be studied academically. It was corrupting by its very nature. Those who opened themselves to it inevitably became consumed by it, transforming from wise philosophers into power-hungry tyrants. The dark side fed on negative emotions, anger, fear, hatred, and strengthened them in a feedback loop that became impossible to escape. The dark side faction disagreed. They argued that the Jedi leadership's refusal to study the dark side was based on fear rather than wisdom, that their insistence on suppressing emotion was creating Jedi who were powerful but psychologically stunted, unable to feel the full spectrum of existence. They believed that a Jedi who understood both light and dark could achieve a balance that would make them more powerful and more wise than one who knew only half of the Force. The philosophical debate became increasingly heated over decades. The dark side faction grew in numbers as they recruited young Jedi who chafed under the Order's restrictions, who felt that their true potential was being limited by outdated dogma. The traditionalists watched with growing alarm as these dark Jedi began openly using dark side techniques, conducting experiments that the Council had explicitly forbidden, and establishing their own training centers separate from official Jedi academies. The breaking point came when the dark Jedi faction attempted a coup. Led by a charismatic Jedi Master whose name has been lost to history, they orchestrated a plan to seize controls of the Jedi Council and reform the Order according to their philosophy. The plan involved infiltrating the Council chambers, using Force persuasion to turn several Council members to their cause, and then using their combined power to overwhelm any resistance. The coup failed. The traditionalist Jedi had been warned by Council members who had resisted the Dark Jedi's mental manipulation. When the Dark Jedi struck, they found themselves facing the full might of the Jedi Order. The battle that followed devastated the Jedi Temple on Coruscant and killed dozens of masters on both sides. The failed coup transformed a philosophical disagreement into open warfare. The Dark Jedi, knowing they would face execution or imprisonment if they surrendered, fled Coruscant with as many followers as they could gather. They commandeered Republic ships, stole Jedi holocrons containing forbidden knowledge, and scattered across the galaxy to establish strongholds from which to continue their fight. What followed was the 100-Year Darkness, a century-long civil war between the Jedi Order and the Dark Jedi faction. This conflict was unlike any war the galaxy had seen before. It was not fought primarily with armies and navies, though both sides recruited soldiers and pilots. It was fought with the Force itself, with techniques that had never been used in open combat before. The Dark Jedi, having fully embraced the dark side by this point, developed powers that horrified the traditionalist Jedi. They used Force lightning to kill from a distance. They employed mental domination to turn enemies into puppets. They created Sith spawn, monsters warped by dark side alchemy that terrorized civilian populations. They drained the life force from captives to extend their own lives. And they discovered that by feeding on fear and suffering, they could amplify their power to levels that light side practitioners could not match. The Jedi Order responded by developing their own combat techniques, refining lightsaber forms specifically designed to counter dark side attacks, and organizing themselves militarily in ways they had never done before. The Jedi Army of Light was formed, a unified military force commanded by Jedi Masters and composed of Republic soldiers who had volunteered to fight against the dark side threat. The war was devastating. Dozens of worlds were caught in the crossfire. Entire populations were enslaved by dark Jedi warlords or killed in battles between Force users. The Republic's economy was strained to breaking point, trying to fund the military operations necessary to combat the dark Jedi strongholds. And the Jedi Order itself was divided, with some members questioning whether the war was worth the cost and others arguing for increasingly extreme measures to end the conflict. The turning point came with the Battle of Korbos, a frozen moon that had become the primary stronghold of the Dark Jedi forces. The Jedi Army of Light launched a massive assault, bringing together hundreds of Jedi Masters and thousands of Republic soldiers in a desperate attempt to end the war decisively. The battle lasted for weeks, with casualties mounting on both sides. In the end, the Jedi were victorious. The Dark Jedi leadership was killed, their stronghold destroyed, and their army scattered. But the victory came at a terrible price. The Jedi Order had lost nearly half its masters. The Republic had spent resources that would take decades to recover, and perhaps most significantly, the Jedi had been forced to become warriors rather than peacekeepers, a transformation that would haunt the Order for millennia. The surviving Dark Jedi, numbering approximately 300 individuals, faced a choice: surrender and face execution, or flee beyond the Republic's borders into the unknown regions. They chose exile. Gathering whatever ships they could salvage from their defeated forces, they fled into uncharted space, seeking a world where they could continue their dark side studies without interference from the Jedi Order. They wandered for years, jumping blindly through hyperspace, surviving on dwindling supplies, watching their numbers decrease as ships failed or individuals died from combat wounds that never properly healed. They had no destination, no plan beyond surviving long enough to find sanctuary. Many died during this exodus, their ships lost in hyperspace accidents or destroyed by unknown dangers in the uncharted regions. But eventually, approximately 75 Dark Jedi ships reached a region of space that would later be called the Sith Worlds. And on the primary inhabited planet in this region, a harsh desert world called Korriban, they discovered the Sith species. The encounter between the Dark Jedi exiles and the Sith species would change galactic history forever. Neither group understood it at the time, but this meeting represented the fusion of two dark side traditions that would create something far more dangerous than either could have achieved alone. Chapter 3. The Conquest of Korriban, When Gods Descended. When the Dark Jedi's battered fleet entered orbit around Korriban, they found a world that seemed almost designed for their needs. The planet radiated dark side energy, its very geology shaped by millennia of force-sensitive inhabitants channeling their power through its stone. The native Sith species possessed the force sensitivity that could make them valuable allies or servants. And most importantly, Korriban was so remote and isolated that the Jedi Order would never find them here. The leader of the Dark Jedi exiles was a human named Ajunta Pal, a former Jedi Master who had become one of the most powerful dark side practitioners in galactic history. Pal had been a brilliant swordsman and Force theorist during his time in the Order, and his century of exile and warfare had only sharpened his skills. He had mastered techniques that would have been impossible for a light side practitioner, including the ability to drain life force from living beings and transfer his consciousness between bodies. When Pal led the first landing parties to Korriban's surface, the Sith species initially saw them as invaders to be resisted. The Sith Lords gathered their warriors and prepared to drive the outsiders from their world. But the Dark Jedi demonstrated powers that the Sith had never imagined were possible. Where Sith sorcery required ritual and preparation, the Dark Jedi could unleash Force lightning with a gesture. Where Sith Force techniques were intuitive and limited by natural talent, the Dark Jedi had systematic training methods that could elevate any practitioner to devastating levels of power. The conquest was not a battle, but a revelation. The Sith Lords, watching the Dark Jedi fight, realized they were witnessing beings who had perfected the use of the Force in ways their species had been groping toward for millennia. Rather than fighting to their deaths, many Sith Lords chose to submit, recognizing that these outsiders had something to teach them. Ajunta Pal made a decision that would shape the next 6,000 years of galactic history. Rather than simply enslaving the Sith species as a conquered people, he and his fellow Dark Jedi chose integration. They would make themselves the rulers of Sith civilization, yes, but they would also adopt Sith culture, intermarry with the Sith species, and create a hybrid civilization that combined Dark Jedi knowledge with Sith tradition. The reasons for this choice were practical as well as philosophical. The Dark Jedi numbered only about 75 at this point, far too few to maintain control over a planet through military force alone. But by positioning themselves as god kings who had descended from the stars, by demonstrating powers that seemed divine to the Sith species, they could rule through reverence rather than fear. The Sith would serve them willingly, seeing them not as conquerors, but as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies about powerful beings who would lead the Sith to greatness. Ajunta Pal declared himself the first Dark Lord of the Sith, taking a title that merged his Dark Jedi identity with Sith tradition. His fellow exiles became the Sith Lords, each ruling over their own domain within the expanding Sith Empire, and they established a pattern that would define Sith civilization for millennia. Power determined position, and only the strong had the right to rule. The integration between Dark Jedi and Sith species happened rapidly over the next few generations. The Dark Jedi took Sith consorts and produced hybrid children who inherited both Force training methods and genetic Force sensitivity. These children, combining the best of both traditions, became even more powerful than their parents. The original pure-blooded Sith remained in Sith society as an aristocratic class, their distinctive red skin and facial tendrils marking them as descended from the original species, but power increasingly mattered more than bloodline. The Dark Jedi brought with them not just Force techniques, but technology that was millennia ahead of what the Sith had developed. They possessed hyperdrive-equipped starships, allowing them to explore the region beyond Korriban. They had advanced weapons and communication systems. They understood metallurgy, architecture, and engineering at levels the Sith species had never achieved. All of this knowledge was integrated into the growing Sith civilization. Within a generation, the Sith Empire had expanded beyond Korriban to encompass the entire Sith world's region. The planet Ziost became the administrative capital, chosen for its more hospitable climate and central location. Dromund Kaas became a major military base and training center. Relg was devoted entirely to Sith sorcery research. Each world developed its own character and purpose within the growing empire. The Dark Jedi also brought with them the stolen Jedi holocrons they had taken during their exile. These contained forbidden knowledge that the Jedi Council had locked away for good reason. Techniques for extending life through the Force, methods for binding spirits to locations, research into Force alchemy and the creation of monsters, and most dangerously, theories about the true nature of the dark side. With access to both, this forbidden knowledge and the intuitive Sith species' understanding of the dark side, the Sith Lords began developing new techniques that combined both traditions. They created Sith alchemy, the art of warping living tissue through the Force to create monsters that served as weapons and guardians. They perfected essence transfer, allowing a Sith Lord to cheat death by possessing a new body when their original one wore out. They developed Sith sorcery rituals that could affect entire planets, poisoning worlds with dark side energy or raising armies of the dead. Most significantly, they formalized the Sith Code, a philosophical statement that would guide the Sith Empire for the next 6,000 years. The code was explicitly designed as an inversion of the Jedi Code, rejecting everything the Jedi stood for and replacing it with Sith values. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. The Force shall free me. Each line of this code represented a fundamental disagreement with Jedi philosophy. Where the Jedi sought peace through harmony, the Sith declared that peace was an illusion and that conflict was the natural state of existence. Where the Jedi suppressed passion and emotion, the Sith celebrated them as sources of power. Where the Jedi served the Force, the Sith sought to dominate it. Where the Jedi believed in duty and self-sacrifice, the Sith believed in personal freedom achieved through power. This code was not just philosophy but practical doctrine. It shaped how the Sith Empire was governed, how Sith Lords competed for position, how apprentices were trained, and how the Empire interacted with other civilizations. It was, in essence, a manual for how to build a society based entirely on the dark side of the Force. The Sith Empire also adopted and expanded the Valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban, turning it into the Empire's greatest monument. Each major Sith Lord constructed their own tomb in the valley, massive structures that served as temples, monuments, and eternal prisons for their spirits. These tombs became rites of passage for young Sith who were sent into them to face the spirits of ancient Dark Lords and prove their worthiness to bear the title of Sith. Within 3 generations of Ajunta Pal's landing on Korriban, the Sith Empire had transformed from a primitive tribal society into a sophisticated dark side civilization. They had hyperdrive-capable starships, advanced weapons, and Force techniques that would have terrified the Jedi Order. They had a population of billions spread across dozens of worlds. And most importantly, they had a philosophy and culture that was completely self-sustaining, no longer dependent on the original Dark Jedi exiles, but carried forward by generation after generation of hybrid Sith who believed absolutely in the rightness of their cause. This was the foundation upon which all future Sith empires would be built. The principles established during these early centuries: power determines worth, the strong rule the weak, the dark side is power itself, would persist even after the original empire fell. Even when the last pure-blooded Sith was dead, even when the Sith species itself was extinct, these principles would survive in the philosophy and training methods passed down through Sith holocrons and teachings. The first true Sith Empire, the civilization created by the fusion of Dark Jedi ambition and Sith tradition, would last for approximately 2,000 years. It would reach heights of power and sophistication that would make it legendary even millennia after its fall. And it would develop the dark side philosophy to such a refined degree that every subsequent Sith organization would look back to this golden age as the template to emulate. But for all its power, for all its achievements, the first Sith Empire contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The Sith philosophy celebrated individual ambition and competition for power. It taught that betrayal was natural, that the weak deserved to be overthrown, that no leader's authority was absolute if someone stronger could challenge them. This created a civilization that was perpetually on the edge of civil war, held together only by the strength of its Dark Lord. And when that Dark Lord's power failed, when ambition finally overwhelmed stability, the entire empire would burn, not from external conquest, but from internal collapse. The Sith would destroy themselves, proving that a civilization built entirely on the dark side could never achieve lasting peace. But that collapse was still 2,000 years in the future, for now the Sith Empire was rising, expanding, and becoming the most powerful dark side civilization the galaxy had ever known. Chapter 4: The Golden Age, 2,000 Years of Dark Glory. The period from approximately 6,900 to 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin is considered the Golden Age of the Sith Empire, the apex of the first Sith civilization's power and influence. During these 2 millennia, the Sith transformed from a regional power, controlling a handful of worlds, into a vast empire that rivaled the Republic in size and far exceeded it in military might. The Golden Age began under Ajunta Pal's successors, a line of Dark Lords who each added their own innovations to Sith civilization. Under Marka Ragnos, who ruled for over a century, and whose reign is considered the peak of Sith prosperity, the Empire established trade routes with non-Republic civilizations, built massive temple cities that combined architecture with Sith sorcery, and developed military doctrines that would influence galactic warfare for millennia. The structure of Sith government during this period was theoretically simple but practically complex. At the top was the Dark Lord of the Sith, an individual of supreme power who ruled with absolute authority. Beneath the Dark Lord was the Sith Council, composed of the most powerful Sith Lords in the Empire. Each council member controlled their own sphere of influence: military, intelligence, technology, sorcery, philosophy, and competed constantly for the Dark Lord's favor and ultimately for the position of Dark Lord itself. Below the council were the lesser Sith Lords, numbering in the hundreds, each controlling their own domain within the Empire. These domains could be planets, fleets, research facilities, or simply large numbers of apprentices. A Sith Lord's power was measured not just by their personal force abilities, but by their resources, their followers, and their political connections. Rising through the Sith hierarchy required not just strength but cunning, the ability to form and break alliances, and the willingness to betray anyone who stood between you and greater power. The competition between Sith Lords was institutionalized and celebrated. Duels to the death were common, with the winner taking the loser's position, resources, and sometimes even their apprentices. Assassination was so prevalent that paranoia became a necessary survival skill. Betrayal of masters by apprentices was expected, even encouraged, because it proved the apprentice had truly learned the Sith philosophy and was ready to become a master themselves. This constant internal conflict should have destroyed the Empire, and indeed, there were periods of civil war when no Dark Lord was strong enough to command respect from all the Sith Lords. But paradoxically, this competition also made the Empire stronger. The weak were constantly being eliminated, the strong were constantly being tested, and the entire civilization was engaged in a perpetual process of evolutionary selection that produced incredibly powerful individuals. The Sith military during the Golden Age was the most formidable force in the known galaxy. Sith doctrine emphasized overwhelming force, preemptive strikes, and the use of fear as a weapon. Their fleets were built around massive dreadnoughts that served as both warships and mobile temples, crewed by thousands and commanded by Sith lords who used battle meditation to coordinate their forces with terrifying precision. Sith ground forces combined conventional military units with force-using shock troops. Sith warriors trained from childhood in both lightsaber combat and force techniques led assault teams that could overwhelm positions that normal soldiers could never take. Sith assassins infiltrated enemy facilities weeks before invasions, sabotaging defenses and killing key leaders. And Sith sorcerers created monsters through alchemy that were deployed as living weapons of terror. The Empire's technology advanced rapidly during this period. Scythe engineers, often force-sensitive themselves, developed technologies that integrated the dark side directly into their function. Meditation spheres were starfighters that responded to their pilot's force connection, becoming extensions of the pilot's will. Sith swords were alchemically treated to resist lightsabers and channel dark side energy. The Empire even experimented with superweapons powered by captured force sensitives, though these proved too unstable for practical use. Sith education during the Golden Age was brutal but extraordinarily effective. Children identified as force-sensitive were taken from their families and sent to Sith academies on Korriban, Dromund Kaas, and other worlds. There they were subjected to constant trials, forced to compete against each other for resources and teachers' attention. The weak were killed or enslaved. The moderately talented became soldiers or bureaucrats, and the truly gifted eventually attracted the attention of Sith lords looking for apprentices. The master-apprentice relationship in Sith culture was fundamentally different from that of the Jedi, where Jedi masters sought to guide their Padawans toward wisdom and self-sacrifice. Sith masters used their apprentices as tools and experiments. An apprentice was expected to serve their master absolutely while simultaneously plotting to overthrow them. The master was expected to teach their apprentice everything, while also ensuring they never became powerful enough to actually succeed in betrayal until the master was ready to be replaced. This created a relationship of mutual exploitation and dependency that somehow functioned despite its inherent contradictions. The best Sith masters produced multiple powerful apprentices over their lifetime, with each successive student learning from their predecessors' failures. The most ambitious apprentices would sometimes cooperate to overthrow a particularly powerful master, though such cooperation never lasted beyond the master's death. Sith sorcery reached its apex during the Golden Age, producing techniques that would never be fully recovered by later generations. The greatest Sith alchemists could reshape life at the molecular level, creating entirely new species designed for specific purposes. The most skilled essence transfer practitioners could hop between bodies at will, effectively achieving immortality, and the most powerful ritualists could affect entire star systems, poisoning planets with dark side energy or creating force storms that could destroy fleets. The most significant development in Sith sorcery during this period was the refinement of techniques for preserving consciousness after death. The Sith had always believed that truly powerful Dark Lords could transcend death, and during the Golden Age, this belief became reality. Sith Lords learned to bind their spirits to their tombs, to objects, or even to living hosts. These bound spirits could teach new generations, could possess weak-willed individuals, and could influence events for centuries after their physical deaths. This had profound implications for Sith civilization. It meant that knowledge was never truly lost. A technique developed by a Sith Lord who died 3 centuries ago could still be taught by that Lord's spirit to a student who ventured into their tomb. Philosophies and strategies could be preserved perfectly without the degradation that usually comes from generational transmission. The Sith Empire essentially achieved institutional immortality, with its greatest minds continuing to shape civilization long after their bodies had turned to dust. The Sith also expanded their understanding of the Force's fundamental nature during this period. They identified and cataloged Force nexus points, locations where the Force was particularly strong or where the boundary between the material universe and the Force dimension was unusually thin. They established temples and research facilities at these points, using them to amplify their power and conduct experiments that would have been impossible elsewhere. The Sith philosophy was refined and expanded during the Golden Age by generations of philosophers who debated the implications of the Sith Code. The doctrine of the Dyad explored the idea that 2 Sith working in perfect coordination could achieve power exponentially greater than either could alone. The theory of strength argued that compassion and mercy were not just weaknesses, but actual corruptions of the dark side's purity. The philosophy of passion examined how different emotions, anger, fear, love, hate, connected to the Force and which were most effective for channeling power. These philosophical developments were not mere academic exercises. They shaped how Sith trained their apprentices, how they structured their government, and how they understood their place in the galaxy. The Sith saw themselves not as villains but as liberators, freeing themselves and others from the chains of Jedi dogma and natural limitation. They believed that their way was not just more powerful, but more honest, more aligned with the fundamental nature of existence. The Sith Empire's economy during the Golden Age was based primarily on slavery and conquest. Slaves captured from raids on non-Republic worlds or bred from slave populations performed virtually all manual labor. This allowed Force-sensitive Sith to dedicate themselves entirely to training and research rather than mundane work. The Empire's wealth came from tribute extracted from conquered worlds, from the spoils of military campaigns, and from trade with civilizations that feared the Sith too much to refuse their terms. The slave system was not just economic but ideological. The Sith believed that slavery was simply the natural expression of the strong ruling the weak. They saw no moral problem with enslaving entire populations because those populations had failed to be strong enough to resist. This ideology was so deeply ingrained that even slaves often accepted their position, believing that if they were truly worthy, they would become powerful enough to escape or overthrow their masters. The Sith also established diplomatic relations with other dark side using civilizations, though these relationships were usually more like alliances between predators who temporarily cooperated to take down larger prey. The Sith traded knowledge and technology with groups like the Anzadi Assassins, the Sorcerers of Tund, and various other Force-using traditions. These exchanges enriched Sith knowledge, but also spread Sith philosophy across the galaxy, creating pockets of dark side influence that would persist even after the Empire's fall. During the Golden Age, the Sith Empire remained completely unknown to the Republic. The distances involved were vast, the hyperspace routes were unmapped, and the Republic had no reason to explore the regions where the Sith had established themselves. The Jedi Order believed the Dark Jedi exiles had died in the unknown regions millennia ago. The Republic was focused on its own expansion into the Mid-Rim and dealing with various alien, civilizations that were more immediate threats. This isolation was both blessing and curse for the Sith. It allowed them to develop without interference, to perfect their dark side techniques without worrying about Jedi intervention. But it also meant they had no external enemy to unite against, no threat that could force the constantly competing Sith Lords to work together. The Empire's greatest strength, its celebration of individual ambition and competition, was also its greatest weakness. Without an external enemy, the Sith inevitably turned on each other. The signs of the coming collapse were present even during the height of the Golden Age, though few recognized them at the time. Civil wars became more frequent and more destructive. The Dark Lord's authority was challenged more boldly with each passing century. Philosophical divisions emerged, with some Sith arguing for increased centralization and others insisting that traditional competition must be preserved. The delicate balance that had maintained the Empire for 2 millennia was beginning to fail. And then, 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the isolation ended. 2 Republic explorers accidentally discovered the Sith Empire, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 5. The Great Hyperspace War, First Contact and Catastrophe. The year was 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, when 2 human explorers named Gav and Jori Darrigan, siblings from the Republic frontier world of Sinagar, decided to test a new hyperspace route that they believed would revolutionize galactic trade. They were ambitious but reckless, willing to jump into uncharted space without proper nav computer data in hopes of discovering a faster route between Republic worlds. Their gamble failed catastrophically, their jump calculations were off, and they emerged from hyperspace in completely unknown territory. Worse, their ship's hyperdrive had been damaged in the transition, leaving them stranded. With fuel reserves dwindling, they searched desperately for an inhabitable world where they could land and attempt repairs. They found Korriban. When the Darrigan siblings' ship entered Sith space, it was immediately detected by Sith patrol vessels. The Sith had never encountered Republic ships before, didn't recognize their configuration, and initially believed they might be some new threat. The patrol vessels surrounded the damaged ship and escorted it forcibly to Korriban, where Gav and Jori were taken prisoner and brought before the Sith Council. The Dark Lord of the Sith at this time was Marka Ragnos, but he had recently died after over a century of rule. His death had created a succession crisis, with 2 powerful Sith Lords, Naga Sato and Ludo Kresh, competing for the position of Dark Lord. The arrival of the Republic explorers occurred at the worst possible moment, when the Sith Empire was politically unstable and its leadership divided. Ludo Kresh, the more conservative of the 2 candidates, wanted the explorers executed immediately. He saw them as spies sent by a potentially dangerous enemy civilization. He argued that the Sith should remain isolated, perfecting their power, rather than risking contact with unknown external forces. His philosophy represented traditional Sith thinking, strength through isolation and perfection. Naga Sato disagreed violently. He was younger, more ambitious, and more visionary than Kresh. When Sato interrogated the Darrigan siblings and learned about the Republic, he saw not a threat but an opportunity. The Republic spanned thousands of worlds, controlled vast resources, and was protected by Force users called Jedi. If the Sith could conquer the Republic, they would increase their power 1,000-fold. Sato used the disagreement over the explorers' fate to advance his own political position. He framed Kresh as cowardly, afraid to test Sith power against external enemies. He argued that true strength required conquest, that the Sith had spent too long fighting among themselves when there were entire civilizations waiting to be subjugated, and he promised that if the Sith Council made him Dark Lord, he would lead the Empire to glory by conquering this republic the explorers described. The Council was divided. Many agreed with Kresh that caution was wise, but Sato was charismatic and persuasive, and his vision appealed to the younger, more ambitious Sith Lords. In a move that would have long-lasting implications, Sadow orchestrated a false flag attack on Kresh's fortress using mercenaries, then heroically fought them off and claimed they were Republic agents sent to assassinate Sith leadership. This manufactured crisis gave Sadow the political capital he needed. The Sith Council, frightened by the apparent Republic threat and inspired by Sadow's promises of conquest, named him Dark Lord of the Sith. Sadow immediately began preparations for war, using information extracted from Gav Darrigan, who had been manipulated into cooperation, to map hyperspace routes to Republic space. Ludo Kresh opposed Sadow's plan openly, arguing it would lead to disaster. The Republic was too large to conquer, the Jedi too numerous to defeat, and the Sith Empire lacked the resources for a sustained campaign in foreign territory. Kresh tried to rally opposition within the council, but Sadow moved first. He declared Kresh a traitor, attacked his power base, and forced him into exile. With his main rival removed, Sadow had absolute control over the Empire's military. Sadow spent months preparing the invasion. He assembled the largest Sith fleet ever created, thousands of ships crewed by hundreds of thousands of soldiers. He deployed Sith sorcery on an unprecedented scale, creating monsters that would serve as shock troops. He recruited Force-using warriors from every corner of the Empire, and he used meditation techniques to coordinate this vast force, planning to lead them personally in the conquest of the Republic. The initial Sith attacks were devastatingly successful beyond Sadow's expectations. Republic worlds that had known peace for centuries suddenly found themselves facing an enemy they didn't know existed. The Republic military was designed for peacekeeping and defense against pirates, not for fighting a full-scale invasion by a dark side empire. Sith warships appeared in systems without warning, bombarded planets into submission, and established occupation governments before Republic forces could even respond. The Sith's dark side powers gave them overwhelming tactical advantages. Sith battle meditation allowed individual commanders to coordinate entire fleets with perfect precision. Sith sorcerers created force storms that disabled Republic ships. Sith assassins infiltrated planetary governments and killed key leaders before invasions even began. And Sith lords leading ground assaults were nearly unstoppable, cutting through Republic defenses like they didn't exist. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the military losses. Republic citizens who had believed they lived in an age of peace and prosperity discovered that their civilization was vulnerable to a dark side empire they had never heard of. Fear spread faster than the Sith fleets. Planets surrendered without fighting rather than face bombardment. Others descended into chaos as governments collapsed and populations panicked. Within weeks of the invasion's start, Sadow's forces reached Coruscant itself. The Republic capital, the heart of galactic civilization, suddenly found itself under siege. Sith warships entered orbit and began bombarding the planet's surface. Temples burned, government buildings collapsed, millions fled into the lower levels of the planet city to escape the destruction raining from above. The Jedi Order mobilized in desperation. They had not fought a war in centuries, but they threw every available Jedi Master and Knight into the defense of Coruscant and other key worlds. This was when the Jedi discovered, to their horror, that the enemy they faced were not ordinary dark side users, but the descendants of the Dark Jedi exiles from millennia ago, now commanding an entire empire. The Jedi adapted their tactics rapidly. They realized they couldn't match Sith sorcery directly, but they could disrupt it through coordinated light side meditation. They developed techniques specifically designed to counter Sith battle meditation and force storms. They established Jedi commanders who could provide their own battle meditation to Republic fleets, evening the odds in space combat, and most importantly, they traced the invasion back to its source. A Republic fleet escorted by dozens of Jedi Masters penetrated deep into Sith space while Sato's forces were spread across the Republic. Their target was Korriban, the Sith homeworld and spiritual center of the Empire. If they could strike at the heart of Sith civilization, they might break the invasion's momentum. The attack on Korriban was brutal and decisive. Republic forces, guided by Jory Darrigan, who had escaped Sith captivity and returned to warn the Republic, destroyed the primary Sith temples, bombarded the Valley of the Dark Lords, and killed most of the Sith Council members who had remained behind. The ancient tombs were desecrated, Sith holocrons were destroyed, and the planet that had been the center of Sith civilization for 6,000 years was left in ruins. Naga Sato, coordinating the invasion from his flagship at the Battle of Coruscant, felt through the Force when Korriban fell. He realized immediately that his gamble had failed. The Sith Empire could survive losing battles in Republic space. It could not survive losing its homeworld. Without Korriban, without the ancient knowledge preserved there, without the spiritual center that bound Sith lords together, the Empire would fracture. Sato ordered a retreat, abandoning the Republic campaign and rushing back to defend what remained of the Sith Empire. But he found that in his absence, his rival Ludo Kresh had emerged from exile and rallied Sith lords who opposed the invasion. Kresh claimed the Republic attack on Korriban proved he had been right all along, that Sato's ambition had brought disaster upon the Empire. The final battle of the Great Hyperspace War was fought not between Republic and Sith, but between two factions of the Sith Empire itself. Sato's forces, retreating from Republic space, encountered Kresh's fleet at the Denarii system. Behind them came the pursuing Republic fleet. Sato found himself caught between two enemies, outnumbered and outmaneuvered. In a desperate gambit that would become legendary, Sato used Sith sorcery to trigger a supernova in the Denarii star. The explosion destroyed most of the Republic pursuit fleet, killed Ludo Kresh and his entire force, but also annihilated most of Sato's own remaining ships. Only Sato's flagship and a few escort vessels escaped, fleeing deeper into unknown space while the supernova expanded behind them. Sato eventually reached the remote jungle moon of Yavin 4, where he established a hidden temple. There, using Sith sorcery to place himself in suspended animation, he went into a sleep that would last 4,000 years, waiting for the day when the Sith Empire could rise again. His handful of surviving followers established a primitive civilization on Yavin 4, gradually losing their advanced knowledge and descending into barbarism, but preserving the temple and the sleeping Dark Lord within it. Back in Sith space, the aftermath of the war was catastrophic. The Republic fleet, having destroyed Kresh and most of Sato's forces at Denarii, pushed into the Sith Empire and began a campaign of systematic extermination. They had learned that the Sith were descended from the Dark Jedi exiles and decided that this dark side civilization must be completely eradicated to prevent future threats. Republic forces attacked every Sith world they could find. They bombarded Korriban until the surface was barely habitable. They destroyed the temples on Ziost. They hunted down and killed every Sith Lord and sorcerer they could locate. They burned the Sith libraries and smashed the holocrons. And they hunted the Sith species itself, both purebloods and hybrids, attempting to exterminate the bloodlines that carried dark side force sensitivity. Within a decade of the Great Hyperspace War's end, the first Sith Empire was gone. Korriban was a wasteland. Ziost was occupied by Republic forces. The great temples and tombs that had stood for millennia were ruins. The Sith species was reduced to a few hundred scattered survivors, hiding on remote worlds or kept as slaves by Republic officials who found their Force sensitivity useful. The Republic declared victory. The Jedi Order declared the Sith extinct. The galactic civilization that had lasted 2,000 years, that had been the most powerful dark-side organization in history, had fallen in a single devastating war. But the Sith were not truly extinct. Scattered across the galaxy, a few dozen Sith Lords had survived by hiding, by fleeing beyond Republic space, or by disguising themselves as ordinary citizens. They carried with them holocrons, scrolls, and most importantly, the knowledge and philosophy that defined Sith civilization. As long as that knowledge survived, as long as someone remembered the Sith code and believed in the dark side's supremacy, the Sith could return. And return they would again and again, proving that an idea cannot be killed by destroying those who hold it. The first Sith Empire was dead, but the Sith philosophy would rise again in new forms, in new empires, carried forward by those who refused to accept that the dark side could ever truly be defeated. Act 2, The Resurgent Scythe. Chapter 6, The Brotherhood of the Sith, Exar Kun's Empire of Shadows. 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, 1,000 years after the Great Hyperspace War's devastating conclusion, the Jedi Order believed it had achieved lasting peace. The Sith were historical footnotes taught in Jedi academies as warnings about the dangers of the dark side, but no longer considered an active threat. Young Jedi learned about the ancient Sith Empire the way they learned about any extinct civilization, as interesting history but irrelevant to modern life. Then a brilliant but arrogant Jedi named Exar Kun discovered Naga Sado's tomb on Yavin 4. Kun had been one of the most promising students the Jedi Order had seen in generations. His master, Vodo Siosk Bas, recognized him as perhaps the finest lightsaber duelist of the age, and a Force theorist whose insights into the nature of the Force rivaled those of Council Masters. But Kun possessed a fatal flaw. He believed the Jedi Order's restrictions on Force knowledge were limiting his potential, and he had the arrogance to think he could study the dark side without being corrupted by it. Kun's research into ancient Sith artifacts led him eventually to Yavin 4, where Naga Sado's temple still stood, hidden beneath millennia of jungle growth. When Kun entered the temple and approached the chamber where Sado's consciousness waited in suspended animation, the ancient Dark Lord's spirit awakened and immediately recognized an opportunity. What followed was a masterclass in dark side seduction. Sado did not attack Kun or try to possess him directly. Instead, he positioned himself as a teacher, offering knowledge that the Jedi Order had deliberately suppressed. He showed Kun how to amplify his power through passion rather than serenity. He taught him Sith sorcery techniques that multiplied his abilities. And most importantly, he framed the dark side, not as evil, but as liberation from Jedi dogma. Kun fell gradually, convinced at each step that he was in control, that he was simply expanding his knowledge rather than being corrupted. By the time he realized what had happened, he had already committed acts that would make him hunted by the Jedi Order. At that point, rather than repenting, Kun decided to embrace his transformation fully and declared himself a new Dark Lord of the Sith. But Kun's vision for reviving the Sith was fundamentally different from the ancient empire. He had no Sith species to rule over, no established civilization to command. Instead, he created what he called the Brotherhood of the Sith, essentially a cult dedicated to destroying the Jedi Order and replacing the Republic with a dark side theocracy ruled by Force users. Kun traveled the galaxy, recruiting followers through a combination of Force manipulation, promises of power, and carefully crafted philosophical arguments about the Jedi Order's hypocrisy. His most important recruit was Ulic Kel Droma, a Jedi Knight who had fallen to the dark side while trying to infiltrate a criminal organization. Keldroma brought with him military experience and connections that Kun lacked, making him the perfect partner for Kun's philosophical vision. Together, Kun and Keldroma orchestrated what became known as the Great Sith War. Unlike previous Sith empires that had built up their power over centuries before confronting the Republic, the Brotherhood struck immediately and dramatically. They attacked Jedi enclaves across the galaxy simultaneously, killing masters and recruiting their Padawans to the dark side. They assassinated Republic officials who opposed them, and they declared that a new Sith order would rise from the ashes of the corrupt Jedi system. The Brotherhood's strategy was terrorism and targeted assassination rather than traditional military conquest. Kun used Sith alchemy to create war droids and monsters that could terrorize populations without requiring large armies. Keldroma's criminal connections provided funding and weapons, and both leaders used force powers to terrify their enemies into submission rather than fighting them directly. The most devastating weapon Kun developed during this period was the thought bomb, a dark side technique that could kill every force-sensitive being within a large radius. The thought bomb worked by creating a tear in the force itself, causing a chain reaction that drained life force from all force users within range. Kun theorized that a sufficiently powerful thought bomb could eliminate the entire Jedi Order in a single strike, leaving only non-force-sensitive beings alive. The war reached its climax when a massive Republic and Jedi fleet attacked Yavin 4, attempting to capture or kill Exar Kun before he could deploy the thought bomb against Coruscant. Kun, surrounded and facing imminent defeat, made a desperate choice. He performed a Sith ritual that drained the life force from every living being on Yavin 4, his own followers, the native Masasi species, even the jungle itself, storing their combined life energy in his temple to preserve his consciousness. Kun's physical body died, but his spirit remained. Bound to Yavin 4 for the next 4,000 years, he would influence events from beyond death, his consciousness preserved in the temples, waiting for someone strong enough to release him. But his Brotherhood of the Sith collapsed immediately without his leadership, its followers hunted down and killed or imprisoned by the Jedi Order. Ulic Keldroma survived the war but was severed from the Force by a Jedi technique, becoming an ordinary human again. He spent his remaining years as a wanderer and teacher, warning about the dangers of the dark side and trying to atone for his crimes. But the damage had been done. The Brotherhood of the Sith had proven that the Sith philosophy could survive even without an empire, that it could manifest as a cult or terrorist organization rather than a nation-state. The Great Sith War was shorter, but in some ways more destructive than the Great Hyperspace War. It didn't involve massive fleet battles or planetary bombardments, but it destroyed the Jedi Order's sense of security and proved that Jedi could fall to the dark side, even in an age of peace. The war also left behind dangerous artifacts, Sith holocrons, alchemy-created monsters, temples poisoned with dark side energy that would cause problems for centuries. Once again, the Republic believed it had ended the Sith threat. Once again, they were wrong, because 300 years later, 2 Jedi would discover that the ancient Sith Empire had not been completely destroyed in the Great Hyperspace War. Survivors had fled beyond known space and rebuilt, and they were preparing to return. Chapter 7. Revan's Empire. The perfect 5 years. 3 centuries after Exar Kun's defeat, approximately 3,960 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Jedi Order faced a different kind of threat. The Mandalorian warrior culture had begun a massive campaign of conquest, attacking Republic worlds throughout the Outer Rim. The Jedi Council, adhering to their philosophy of non-aggression, refused to intervene, believing the Council should not commit the Order to war without absolute certainty that doing so served the Force's will. Two young Jedi disagreed. Revan and his friend Malak argued that the Jedi had a duty to defend innocent lives, that waiting for perfect certainty meant allowing millions to die. When the Council refused to authorize intervention, Revan and Malak led a faction of Jedi, eventually numbering in the thousands, to fight the Mandalorians anyway, defying the Council's direct orders. Revan proved to be a military genius. He reformed the Republic military, taught them tactics that could counter Mandalorian warrior culture, and ultimately won the war decisively. But victory came at a cost. During the final battle at Malachor Fiv, Revan ordered the use of a superweapon called the Mass Shadow Generator that killed millions of Mandalorians and Republic soldiers simultaneously, creating a wound in the Force that would scar the galaxy for generations. But Revan's actions during the Mandalorian Wars were not random. He had been investigating rumors throughout the conflict, rumors of a dark influence guiding the Mandalorians, of an ancient enemy waiting beyond the Outer Rim. When the war ended, Revan and Malak pursued those rumors into the unknown regions, seeking the truth about what had driven the Mandalorians to war. They found the true Sith Empire. This was the revelation that would change everything. The Sith Empire had not been destroyed in the Great Hyperspace War. Naga Sato's forces had been defeated, yes, but other Sith Lords had fled beyond known space during the war's final days. They had established a new empire in the unknown regions, led by an emperor named Vitiate, who had ruled for over 1,000 years through dark-side sorcery and essence transfer. Vitiate captured Revan and Malak. Through torture, mental domination, and promises of power, he corrupted both Jedi to the dark side and sent them back to the Republic as his advance agents. Their mission was to conquer the Republic, softening it up for the true Sith Empire's eventual invasion while remaining unaware they were being manipulated. But Revan was too strong-willed to remain a puppet. He broke free of Vitiate's conditioning, though not completely. He retained the dark side corruption and the Emperor's teachings, but he regained his own will and priorities. And Revan realized something terrifying. The true Sith Empire was coming, and the Republic was not strong enough to survive its invasion. Revan made a choice that would be debated by historians for millennia. He decided to conquer the Republic himself, not to destroy it, but to transform it into a strong, unified military state capable of resisting the true Sith. When they eventually attacked, he would become a Sith Lord, would use dark side powers and tyrannical methods, but all in service of protecting the galaxy from a threat only he knew about. This was the birth of Revan's Sith Empire, the third incarnation of the Sith and perhaps the most paradoxical. It lasted only 5 years, from 3059 to 3154 before the Battle of Yavin. But in that time, Revan accomplished something no previous Sith had managed. He built an empire that actually improved the lives of those it conquered, while simultaneously preparing them for war. Revan's methods were surgical and precise. Rather than attacking heavily populated core worlds, he targeted corrupt Republic officials and inefficient bureaucracies. He exposed scandals within the Republic government, turning public opinion against the establishment. He offered Republic military units the chance to join him voluntarily, giving them better equipment and training than the Republic provided. And most importantly, he spared civilians and left planetary economies intact, making his conquests far less devastating than traditional Sith invasion. The Republic military that joined Revan did so not out of fear, but conviction. Revan convinced them that the Republic government was corrupt, that the Jedi Council was hypocritical, and that only a strong military dictatorship could save civilization from the threats gathering beyond known space. It was a seductive argument, especially coming from the hero who had saved the Republic from the Mandalorians. Within 3 years, Revan controlled a third of Republic space. His Sith empire wasn't like the ancient Sith civilization. It had no Sith species, no generations of dark side tradition. It was simply a military dictatorship ruled by a dark side force user who happened to call himself a Sith Lord. But it was extraordinarily effective, more so than the ancient empire had ever been, because Revan understood something previous Sith had not. Fear and tyranny were inefficient. A population that supported you out of conviction was far more valuable than one that submitted out of terror. Revan's empire would have continued expanding, possibly conquering the entire Republic within a decade, if not for 2 factors. First, his apprentice Malak began to chafe under Revan's leadership. Malak had been corrupted more thoroughly by Vitiate, and he lacked Revan's vision. He wanted pure conquest and domination, not Revan's complex strategy of limited warfare and careful administration. Second, the Jedi Order developed a desperate plan to stop Revan. When Malak betrayed Revan during a Republic ambush, firing on his master's ship in an attempt to kill both Revan and the attacking Jedi, the Jedi captured Revan's critically injured body. They then did something unprecedented. They used the Force to erase Revan's memories completely, giving him a new identity as a loyal Republic soldier. This reborn Revan, with no memory of being a Sith Lord, eventually recovered fragments of his past and was forced to confront what he had become. He chose to embrace the light side again, defeated Malak, and destroyed the Star-forged superweapon that had been powering his former empire. Revan's Sith empire collapsed, its forces scattered or reintegrated into the Republic military. But Revan had accomplished his true mission. The Republic military was stronger, better trained, and more unified than before. The corrupt officials he had exposed were gone, replaced by more competent leadership. And most importantly, the Republic was psychologically prepared for total war in a way it had not been before Revan's conquest. When Revan disappeared into the unknown regions years later, he went to confront the true Sith Empire and its emperor. He failed to destroy Vitiate, but he succeeded in delaying the true Sith invasion for 3 centuries, giving the Republic time to continue strengthening itself. Revan's Sith Empire proved something important about the Sith philosophy. It could be adapted, could evolve beyond its original form. Revan had taken the Sith code, peace is a lie, passion gives strength, and applied it in service of a goal the ancient Sith would never have understood, protecting civilization rather than dominating it. Whether this made him less of a true Sith or more of one remains debated by scholars to this day. Chapter 8. The True Sith Empire Returns. The 3-Century War. 300 years after Revan's disappearance, approximately 3,181 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Sith Empire finally revealed itself. The true Sith, the descendants of those who had fled after the Great Hyperspace War, emerged from the unknown regions with a fleet that dwarfed anything the Republic had ever assembled. This was the 4th incarnation of the Sith Empire, and it would prove to be the longest-lasting and most destructive. The true Sith Emperor Vitiate had spent over a millennium preparing for this moment. His empire had a population of billions spread across dozens of worlds in the unknown regions. His military had been training for this invasion for 3,000 years, refining tactics and weapons specifically designed to defeat the Republic and the Jedi. His Sith Lords had perfected dark side techniques that made them more powerful than any previous generation. And most terrifyingly, Vitiate himself had discovered a form of immortality that made him nearly impossible to kill. The invasion's opening move demonstrated the true Sith's sophistication. Rather than striking at heavily defended core worlds, They attacked the Republic's supply lines and communication networks throughout the Mid-Rim. Within weeks, dozens of systems were isolated from the rest of the Republic, unable to receive reinforcements or even communicate with Coruscant. By the time the Republic realized the scale of the attack, they had already lost effective control over a quarter of their territory. The true Sith military doctrine was based on overwhelming force and terror tactics. Their armies would surround a planet, demand unconditional surrender, and if refused, would bombard the surface until resistance ceased. Sith Lords led assault teams that could devastate planetary defenses in hours, and Sith assassins infiltrated Republic governments months before invasions, sabotaging defenses and killing key leaders. The Jedi Order mobilized immediately, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Sith had studied Jedi techniques during their exile, developing specific counters to Jedi abilities. For every Force technique the Jedi employed, the Sith had a counter technique. For every lightsaber form the Jedi had perfected, the Sith had developed a form designed to defeat it. The war that followed lasted 40 years of active combat, the longest sustained military conflict in galactic history. Entire sectors changed hands repeatedly. Planets were bombarded into submission, occupied by Sith forces, then liberated by Republic counterattacks, then reconquered again. Billions died, trillions suffered under occupation. The galactic economy collapsed, and both sides committed atrocities that would be remembered for millennia. The Republic was pushed back steadily toward the core worlds. The Sith Empire conquered Balmorra, a key industrial world. They took Ord Mantell, a major military base. They invaded Alderaan and held it for years before being pushed out. Every victory for the Republic came at devastating cost, and every defeat brought them closer to total collapse. The turning point came with the Treaty of Coruscant. The Sith launched a surprise attack on the Republic capital, while peace negotiations were supposedly underway. Sith forces devastated Coruscant's defenses, destroyed the Jedi Temple, killed thousands of Jedi, and forced the Republic Senate to accept a humiliating treaty that ceded dozens of systems to Sith control. The Treaty of Coruscant divided the galaxy. The Sith Empire controlled much of the outer and mid-rim. The Republic held the core worlds, and between them was a Cold War, a state of permanent tension where open combat was suspended but proxy wars, espionage, and border skirmishes continued constantly. This arrangement lasted for years until the Emperor's true plan was revealed. Vitiate had never wanted to simply conquer the Republic. He wanted to consume all life in the galaxy, using a massive force ritual to drain the life force from every living being and transform himself into an immortal dark side entity of godlike power. The Sith Empire was just a tool to accomplish this goal, as expendable as the Republic. When both the Sith Dark Council and the Republic government learned of Vitiate's plan, they faced an impossible choice. They had been enemies for decades, had killed millions of each other's citizens, had committed atrocities that seemed unforgivable. But Vitiate's plan would destroy both civilizations. They had to cooperate or face extinction. The alliance against Vitiate was unprecedented. Sith Lords and Jedi Masters worked together for the first time since the ancient Jedi Order. Republic soldiers fought alongside Sith military units, and together they launched a desperate campaign to stop their own Emperor from completing his ritual and destroying all life in the galaxy. The final confrontation took place on Dromund Kaas, the Sith Empire's capital. A combined force of Republic and Sith attacked the Emperor's fortress, fighting through waves of his most fanatical followers. The battle was devastating, with thousands dying on both sides. But eventually, a small group of heroes, both light and dark side force users, reached Vitiate's ritual chamber and disrupted his ritual. The Emperor was defeated, but not destroyed. His physical form was shattered, but his consciousness survived, fleeing into the unknown regions to await another opportunity. But his defeat broke the true Sith Empire. Without his dark side presence binding them together, without his strategic vision coordinating their forces, the Empire fragmented. Over the next century, the true Sith Empire gradually dissolved. Sith lords fought among themselves for control. Systems declared independence. The Dark Council collapsed into competing factions. By 3,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the last remnants of the true Sith Empire had ceased to exist as a unified entity. The galaxy entered a period of recovery. Both the Republic and what remained of the Sith Empire were exhausted, their populations devastated, their economies in ruins. The Sith, as a major political force, seemed to have ended. Individual Sith lords still existed, small cults persisted, but the age of Sith empires appeared to be over. The Republic believed it had finally permanently defeated the Sith threat. The Jedi Order, though greatly weakened, believed the dark side had been contained. They were optimistic that the galaxy could now enjoy lasting peace. They were, once again, catastrophically wrong, because while the true Sith Empire had fallen, one Sith Lord was watching its collapse and learning from it. His name was Darth Bane, and he would transform the Sith from a failing empire into something far more dangerous, a hidden conspiracy that would operate in the shadows for 1,000 years, culminating in the complete destruction of the Jedi Order and the creation of the most successful Sith empire in galactic history.